Hey, government students, Mr. Summers here again with American Government Lectures. All right, we are starting Chapter 2 this week, talking about the origins of American government. And today we're going to be tackling Lesson 1, talking about government in colonial America. All right, so here we go. All right, start off talking about our political heritage. So where do our ideas of politics basically come from? Well, going all the way back to the 1600s, it's not the furthest back we'll go yet, but in the 1600s, a bunch of English people came here from England. That's why they're called English. They arrived here on the east coast of North America, and they began creating villages and towns. Okay, so these early settlers usually were Protestant Christians. That means they were non-Catholics that believed in Jesus Christ and the Bible. Okay, now those early government systems that they created in the early laws, they were initially founded in the Bible. They were laws from the Bible. 10 Commandments played a huge role. Old Testament, New Testament, okay? The Bible talks a lot, especially in the Old Testament, about the rule of law and that even kings need to follow the rule of law. Talked about people being created in the image of God and therefore being equal. Fair treatment and fair trials and representation is all talked about in the Old and New Testament of the Bible. So we have that kind of Christian base for the early laws and government that started out. Okay, then we look at England itself, where all of these colonists were coming from. And so they brought with them English law and tradition. Okay, these laws and traditions influenced the development of the government systems that they used here in the colonies. So some of the colonies were set up with charters from a king. That means it was a set of laws. It gave them the right to certain property and things like that. So, for example, the territory of Virginia was created with a charter, and there was actual company that the king had given authority to start the colony of Virginia. And this company, like a corporation, basically made money off of sending people to the Americas, and therefore them, initially they were sent to look for gold. They didn't find any, but then they started growing crops like tobacco and cotton and rice and indigo and other things and began making money from that. They had a charter that allowed them to do that. It also established their government and government systems. So some colonies were created with charters from the king. Others just kind of created themselves as people arrived in groups and claimed a bunch of land, and they started their own government systems. Those influences, that role of government, slowly developed until the American Revolution and kind of led to the government system that we have today. Okay, so we'll see some of those other influences. We'll talk about them as we go through this. So one of the first things we look at is limited government. Where did the idea of limited government come from? Well, limited government is the concept that the power of government is not absolute. That means a government can't do anything and everything that it wants, that it is limited. The first document to limit government is known as the Magna Carta. Magna Carta in Latin means great letter or big letter. So this was 1215 AD, really long time ago. Bunch of English nobles. Nobles are landowners, people who a king has given a title to. They've been titled noble, like a baron or a lord or something like that. A lot of times they are knights, and they're given a segment of land and they rule over that land, okay? So in this time, 1215 AD, there's this king by the name of John. His brother Richard the Lionheart, was off fighting a war, one of the wars in Jerusalem, okay, one of the Crusades. And John was left. He was the younger brother. He was left in control of everything. And he wasn't a very good king. He started creating more oppressive laws, like he wouldn't let anybody hunt at all. Killing any animals was against the law. He increased taxes greatly because he had to pay for his brother's war in Jerusalem, and he wanted to live, a really high life. So he began to increase or levy taxes. Um, and so his nobles rose up against him. They drew up this document that they called the Magna Carta that limited his power, basically created them as a council. And so then any laws that John wanted to create, he had to get permission from this council of nobles, later would become known as Parliament, in order to get anything done. It also protected people against unjust punishment. So you are actually probably familiar with this story of the Magna Carta. You just don't realize it. We've got this picture over here. One of the beloved Disney movies, Robin Hood, and all the other variations of Robin Hood. The story of Robin Hood is the story of the Magna Carta. Prince John in Robin Hood is King John in the history of the Magna Carta. And Robin Hood was one of the nobles, Robin of Locksley. His father was one of the nobles that helped draw up the Magna Carta. And Robin was considered an outlaw because allegedly or supposedly he fought back against the taxes and was one of the nobles who tried to force John to sign the Magna Carta. And his family, the Locksleys, lost their nobleship, lost their titles, and all of their lands. So that's how he became a hood. In other words, a lawbreaker. There is a newer version of Robin Hood. It was done in 2010 that does bring up the Magna Carta. There's a link to it there in IMDb if you want to look at it, or just, Google 2010 Robin Hood movie. Okay, then in 1689, the English Parliament passed a series of laws known as the English Bill of Rights. It was a series of laws. It's not one document, it was a series of them, but put together we refer to them as the English Bill of Rights. Now, the year earlier, 1688, there were King James II was king, and Parliament didn't really like him, and they kicked him out. And instead, they went and got James's niece, Mary, and her husband, William, from the Netherlands. They'd been living in the Netherlands. William was from the Netherlands. They brought them in and made them king and queen. William and Mary became king and queen, and they forced William and Mary, Parliament did, to sign these documents becoming the English Bill of Rights. And basically what the English Bill of Rights did was it limited the power of the monarchs, the kings and queens, saying that they don't have absolute authority, that they rule with the consent of Parliament because Parliament had made them king and queen. Parliament has to give permission to a king or queen to suspend any laws, to levy or raise taxes, to raise an army. Made a rule saying monarchs cannot interfere with elections or debates in Parliament. And that the people have a right to a fair and speedy trial and a trial by jury of their peers. So their peers are the other people that are like them. So if you're a noble who gets arrested and charged with a crime, you'd have a jury of other nobles. If you were a commoner, you'd have a jury of other commoners, so on and so forth. Okay. Also got rid of cruel and unusual punishment. Things like you've probably seen in movies like the stocks. It's where they put their hands and head through a big wooden thing and they're left there. Or drawn quartering. That's where they would basically strip a person naked in public and then tie them to a table, give them some drugs to keep them awake while they tortured them to death by cutting their insides out, literally, and then cutting them into pieces. They'd only die after there was no more blood left to pump through their body or their heart just stopped. So pretty cruel and crazy stuff. Made all of that illegal. Okay, so the English colonists, or the American colonists, when they came here, they, had this knowledge. They knew what these things were. They were English citizens, and they wanted to do things their way. Okay, so then we end up with the Enlightenment. Okay, so starting in 1700, you have the Enlightenment philosophers of Europe. They influenced the American colonies in a pretty big way. The first of these that we'll talk about is this handsome gentleman over here. I guess you could say, I don't know. Anyway, Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes wrote a book called Leviathan. That's a picture of it over there. And Hobbes thought the natural state of man was war, that they were constantly living in fear of each other, always watching their back to see who wants to kill them or take their property from them. And because of that fear, that's why people, men in particular, and yes, men, he specifically refers to men, okay? And that's actually who they meant back then, men, not humans, not mankind, not people, men. Men were the only ones who had any political rights back then, okay? So he said that that's why men were willing to give up individual liberty, freedom, and for the security of living in a society under a government. Okay, so this is the idea of natural state of nature, right? Okay, Thomas Hobbes, state of nature, that men were constantly at war, that it was nasty, brutish, and horrible. Okay, then we have John Locke a few years later. Okay, and John Locke said that men were born equal and were given certain rights that could not be denied to them. No man could take away from them their property, their life, or their freedom. Okay, so being subject to the government without their consent, and this was in a not really a book but a pamphlet called the Second Treatise of Government. That was in 1690, so about 30 years after Hobbes. John Locke also wrote in there about natural law, that we have the rights given to us at birth and are part of a natural order of things, that those rights are the right to life, liberty, and property. And then we have Jean-Jacques Rousseau from Switzerland, a Swiss philosopher, who also said that people are the ones who hold all political authority, and they give that authority to a leader or a government of their choosing in return for safety, security, and a guarantee of those natural rights. So Rousseau and Locke agreed with each other. Locke and Hobbes disagreed with each other, especially on natural law. But also, Rousseau wrote a lot about this thing called the social contract. The social contract was this idea that people give up their liberties to a government that they choose, and that government then agrees to protect those natural rights. Locke talked about that as well. We also call this consent of the governed, because the people are having to give their consent, so they have to agree with the government, agree to give up their freedom to the government in order for the government to protect. So it's two-sided. People agree to give up their freedom. The government agrees to give them safety, security, and protect their rights. Okay. Some of the rights that Rousseau believed in, of course, were also life, liberty, and property ownership. But he also thought that people had freedom of speech and freedom of religion. You're free to have whatever religion you want, regardless of where you lived or what the king believed. Okay. Then we have Baron Charles-Louis Montesquieu. Oh, Montesquieu, French Enlightenment philosopher. He wrote about the importance of separation of the powers of government as a guard against tyranny and corruption. So here's a quote from his book called The Spirit of Laws. And he basically says, or he says exactly, in order to have this liberty, it is necessary the government be so constituted as one man need be afraid of another. In other words, that government is created in a way in which people are afraid of each other. So the government should be afraid of its different parts. When the legislative and executive powers are united, he says, in the same body of magistrates, there can be no liberty. Again, there is no liberty if the judiciary power be not separated from the legislative and executive. Were it joined with the legislative, the life and liberty of the subject would be exposed to the arbitrary control. For the judge would be then the legislator. Were it joined to the executive power, the judge might behave with violence and oppression. Okay? So, in other words, when you have a government that has the legislative, the lawmaking power, the judiciary power, the court system, and the executive power, the power to enforce laws, all together into one person or a very small group of people where any of those powers are shared, you have corruption and tyranny, and you have no liberty. I'm going to move myself over here. Okay, now we switch then to the colonial governments. So, with those ideas, we have the colonial governments begin to establish themselves. Now, each of the 13 American colonies had some things in common. They had, number one, a governor. Now, usually that governor was appointed by the King of England in pretty much 10 out of the 13 colonies. Okay. Then they had a legislature. That's the lawmaking body. And those lawmaking bodies were made up of representatives elected by the colonists themselves. Now, sometimes in some of those colonies, um, the king had to approve each of the representatives. So once they were elected by the people, basically those elected representatives then had to get on a boat, make the 3-month travel to England, meet with the king. The king would say, "Yeah, you're good." And then they'd have to make the 3-month travel back and say, "Yay, the king approved us." And then they were, legit. They also had a court system that was also run usually by the colonies, but they had to follow British law, English law. So the laws that Parliament passed, those court systems in the colonies had to support those laws. Okay, so they had local control. They had control over their towns and their villages and over the colony, generally speaking. But then they were also subject to Parliament in England and what Parliament in England would rule. So any laws that Parliament in England passed, the colonies here had to enforce as well, regardless of what was going on. Now, also, a little bit different, the only people who were eligible to vote in those colonies were in any colony, all of the colonies, they were all the same. The only people who were allowed to vote were property owning white men who paid taxes. Okay, so property owning white men, not property owning white women, not freed slaves, nobody else. Only property owning white men who paid taxes could vote. Now, also, 9 of the 13 colonies had an official church, and many of those were intolerant to any other religions. So, how did we get to written constitutions? Well, starting off, Mayflower. Okay? Back in 1620, when the Pilgrims came from England to what is now Massachusetts, they signed what's called the Mayflower Compact. So they got together, it's this picture right up here, on the Mayflower. There's the boat right there. There's the Mayflower, or a replica of it. Okay, they got together in their cabin, and the men, you see one, maybe 2 women in there, but the men are sitting back. They wrote out this document, okay, for self-government. It allowed them to choose who their leaders would be, so they had elected representatives, and it allowed them to make their own laws. Well, the men anyway. The women didn't have any say in any of it. Then in 1639, a group of English colonists settled in Connecticut. And when they came to Connecticut, they drew up what is known as the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. So it's the second written self-government document in the colonies. The Fundamental Orders of Connecticut gave the people the right to elect a governor, judges, and representatives to help make laws. Soon after 1639, other colonies began forming. They created their own charters and began, forming their own governments then in a way with their own charters. Those charters, pretty much all of those charters had to be approved by what was known as the King's Privy Council. So this was a group of advisors to the king. And if you were wanting to start a new colony, you had to go to the Americas, claim the land, write up the charter, go back to England, show the charter to the King's Privy Council. They have to read through it. They'd make any changes to it that they wanted. Then they'd sign off on it and stamp it, and it was good to go. But then you had to return. Sometimes it was every 5 years, sometimes every 10 years, sometimes every 20 years. It just kind of depended on the mood of the Privy Council and kind of how much they trusted you and your group of people and whether they liked you or not. So if they didn't like you very much, you maybe got a 5-year charter and you have to come back every 5 years to renew. So that'd be a bit of a pain. You'd have to take 6 months to a year out of your life to travel back to England to get your charter renewed every time. Most of those charters, when they were created, the type of government that they made was a government that divided the power of government between three groups: a governor, the legislative assembly, and the courts. Okay, so those really are the three powers of government: the executive, which is the governor, which is the power to execute or enforce laws, the legislative power, which is the power to create laws, and then the power of the courts, which is the judicial power, which is the power to interpret the law and resolve conflict. So most of the colonial legislatures were representative. And starting in about 1670, the English kings began to ignore the colonies more or less. The colonies were sending goods over to England and making money. The colonies were making money. The king was making money off of the goods. Things were going fine. There were no problems. And so the king kind of eventually kind of went, whatever, do your thing. And he let them rule kind of how they wanted. So without a whole lot of control anymore by the king, they didn't have to go back to England to get their charters renewed or anything like that. They were told they're all good. So then legislatures began to change a little bit. They began to become a lot more representative of the people. They began to change some of their laws. They began to kind of ignore some of the laws coming from Parliament a little bit. Some legislatures actually went along with their communities and allowed religious leaders to control them, mostly in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, a couple of other places. But by 1776, this idea of self-government and representative government was extremely common in the colonies. And so in the late 1760s and 1770s, when King George III began to try to push back against the colonies and try to force them to follow law, they're like, yeah, for like 100 years, dude, none of you have cared. Now all of a sudden you care and you want to make us do what you want us to do. Yeah, we don't think so. Revolution begins. Okay, so that brings us to the end of lesson 1. So here is the essential question: what influenced the development of our government institutions today? Few things. First off, the Magna Carta in 1215, first document to limit the power of a king. Okay, took away their right to raise taxes whenever they wanted and gave the people a few rights. 1688, 1689, English Parliament removes King James II, okay, showing that they had the power to make people king and remove them from the monarchy, and forced then William and Mary to sign the English Bill of Rights in 1689. The influence of Enlightenment philosophers like Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu, their ideas of natural rights, social contract, and separation of powers helped influence our government. And we'll see more about how exactly that happens. And then the colonial governments that put those ideas into practice here: self-rule, representation, democratic principles, allowing people to vote and have a say in their government. All of those things have basically led us to the type of government that we have today and where we are today with our government. And we'll be talking more about that in the next coming installment. Looking for lesson 2. That'll be coming up in a few days. So have a great day. See y'all later. Be good humans.